Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea, and this month's interview is going to be a bit different. My guest is Dr. Marco Pasi, the director of the Center for History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents, also known as the HHP Center, located at the University of Amsterdam. Dr. Pasi is also associate professor in the history of Western Esotericism in the modern period at the University of Amsterdam. Dr. Pasi was one of my professors during my bachelor and research master programs, and he was my supervisor for my research master thesis. After graduating last year, I started this platform, Rejected Religion, and was very fortunate to begin a collaboration shortly after that with the HHP Center. And I now work with Dr. Pasi and his team on various promotional items to help highlight the HHP Center's work. You can find out more about that at my website if you're interested, or visit my YouTube channel. Last year, in 2019, I was also part of a conference hosted by the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism, otherwise known as ESWE, acting as one of the presenters, but also as the coordinator for the volunteers that were helping during the conference. It was at this conference that a special book was presented called Hermes Explains, 30 Questions About Western Esotericism. And Dr. Pasi is one of the 3 editors of this book, as well as an author of one of the essays. All of the participants of the conference got this book as a gift, and upon reading it, I felt it might be a good book to share with all of you, as it deals with many questions that arise when approaching the topic of Western esotericism. So this episode will be a mini history lesson that covers several different subjects. In this first part, Marco explains more about the concept of the book and how it came to be. He also gives some background as to who Hermes was, why esotericism is a bit confusing to try to explain to people, and also why it's an important area of study. We then go on to talk about one of the essays from the book that discusses secret societies and the Illuminati in particular. I hope you enjoy part 1. Welcome to the podcast, Marco. I'm very happy to have you here with me today, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. You've joined me today to discuss a special book called Hermes Explains, and Hermes, we could say Hermes, depending on where you live and how you pronounce the name. But Hermes Explains, 30 Questions About Western Esotericism. So the first question I have is, can you tell me how this book came to be and why?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. I'm very happy to be here with you today. So, how did the book come to be? In 2019, the HHP Center here at the University of Amsterdam, so the Center for the History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents, organized the biannual ESWE conference. So this is the conference of the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism, and these conferences take place every 2 years in a different place. And in 2019, it was our turn to organize this conference, so we did it in Amsterdam. And it was a bit of a coincidence because 2019 happened to be also the 20th anniversary of the existence of the center, of the HHP Center. And so we thought that it would be a nice thing to do to prepare a book, a collection of essays, and to invite all the colleagues, the friends who had in one way or another collaborated with us over the years, so who had been involved in our center because they came here to teach, perhaps for a certain period, Some of them were actually here before me as professors, and then they moved on to some other positions, to some other places. Some were just temporary collaborators, and some others just collaborated with us for particular projects in the past. So we invited them to write a short essay, and this would be a nice collection that we would offer to all the participants to the conference. So this is something actually that we had done 10 years earlier already, because in 2009, it was the 10th anniversary of the HHP Center, and we had already prepared something similar, actually a small book, which I think people can download from our website now for free as a PDF. That's not the case, of course, for the new book, for Hermes Explains. I think the publisher wants to sell the book for a while before it becomes an open access book. So yeah, the idea was basically to ask all these friends and colleagues to write about a subject that they have worked on, particularly in the past, in a way that would be very accessible. So not necessarily simplifying things too much, but in a way that would be understandable and accessible also to people who are not already part of our community, so who are not specialists of Western esotericism.
Right.
And the basic idea was to dispel some of the prejudices or some of the preconceived ideas that people may have about Western esotericism. So that's why the titles of the essays, they are all formulated as questions. Something like, is it true that Western esotericism is this and that? And then, people would say, no, of course, it's not true. I mean, there is a widespread idea that this is so, but, and then they would explain in relatively simple terms why that is not the case, or maybe that is partially the case, but not entirely the case, and so on and so forth. So what we have as the final result is a kind of very nice, comprehensive picture of what the field of Western esotericism is about. What the kind of stuff that we study, the kind of stuff that we do research on, and this is presented in a way that makes the whole business of Western esotericism sort of understandable, also for laypersons.
Exactly. That's why I thought this might be a very interesting book to cover on the podcast. So, because it does ask a lot of very common questions, but the questions are very important. And by reading all of these essays, you get a better idea of what it is that the academics are talking about when they talk about Western esotericism. So the title is Hermes Explains, or Hermes Explains, depending on where you live and how you pronounce it.
Well, I say Hermete in Italian. So.
Right. We can say it in many, many ways. I'm just going to stay with Hermes, but it can also, Americans say Hermes probably. But we're talking about this Hermes character. Who is Hermes, or was Hermes, and why is he important to the field of Western esotericism?
Well, Hermes originally is a Greek god, and he belongs to the Olympic pantheon together with other gods. And typically he is supposed to be the messenger of the gods. So he is a kind of middle person, so to speak, between the gods themselves and the humans and human beings. And then, of course, there are other traits that are associated with Hermes. He is supposed to be a bit of a thief. He's the protector of thieves. also a bit of a liar, maybe sometimes. He is very witty. He has very quick brains. And he's very fast, of course, so that, in fact, very often he is depicted with wings at his ankles or feet. Now, that's the original identity of Hermes as a god. But then, in antiquity, quite a few exchanges of cultures took place. There was this very important meeting between Greek culture and Egyptian culture. And as with many other such situations, when this encounter took place, then there was also a phenomenon of translation or transfer, so that analogies were being looked for or sought between the different forms of religion of the two cultures. So that led to the assimilation of some of the gods from one context to the other. And so the figure of Hermes, the Greek god, was associated to an Egyptian god called Thoth, which was the god supposed to have invented writing for the Egyptians. So it was also a god there, usually represented with the head of an ibis. This was typical phenomenon. I mean, this kind of assimilations and analogies between different pantheons is something that was taking place throughout the Euro-Mediterranean region, so to speak. When cultures would meet, this would take place. Now, this is particularly relevant for our story, this sort of encounter between the Greek god and the Egyptian god, because there is a very important body of literature, which is usually referred to as the Hermetica or the Corpus Hermeticum, which is traditionally attributed to Hermes, to Hermes Trismegistus. So this is represented as a kind of a very wise person, as an initiate or an adept, who has very deep wisdom about the secrets of the universe, about the origin of the universe, the origin of humanity, and what is our situation on this planet, how we can progress towards higher states of being, and so on and so forth. So this mythical, legendary figure became the epitome, so to speak, of the esoteric wise person. And he was included in a list, actually, of wise men of antiquity, such as Moses, such as Zoroaster, which is the typical chain of initiates that you have in this mythical histories of Western esotericism. This is something that you find very, very often. So Hermes Trismegistus is, perhaps for those who study Western esotericism and Hermetic literature, the most important figure with respect to the mythical side of the story, of course. So, and insofar as here in Amsterdam, we call ourselves the Center for the History of Hermetic Philosophy. Mm-hmm. So it makes sense to refer to Hermes in this context. And that's why Hermes is also on the cover of the book, and it comes up again and again. And let's not forget that in Amsterdam, we also have the Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica. Now it has changed the name. It prefers to be called the Embassy of the Free Mind. But Hermes has always been very present here in Amsterdam. So indeed. I think the reference is quite obvious.
Yes. Okay. In the introduction of the book, many different terms are used to refer to Western esotericism. And those being, there's a long list here, but they are Hermetism, as we had discussed, Gnosticism, Neoplatonic theurgy, astrology, alchemy, natural magic, Kabbalah or Kabbalah, depending on how you pronounce that word, Rosicrucianism, Christian theosophy, Illuminism, occultism, spiritualism, traditionalism, neo-paganism, New Age, and occulture. Now, I'm not going to ask you to explain what all of those terms mean, but for the sake of this discussion, can you perhaps explain why all of these separate historical streams of thought are all listed under the umbrella term of Western esotericism?
Well, so to begin with, I think that there is a general consensus among scholars who study Western esotericism that esotericism is a kind of common term that we can use in order to describe a general phenomenon, so to speak, that emerges at some point somewhere in a particular place and then, evolves and transforms and changes and takes all sorts of new forms. Okay. Now, there is a discussion about whether you want to use the term Western as a qualification to esotericism or not. We don't need to get into this now.
Right.
But let's say that at least with respect to the term of esotericism, I think most would agree that that's, adequate enough as a general term to describe this very, very broad phenomenon that goes back to antiquity and that is still alive and present today in our cultures, in our societies. Now, within this very broad phenomenon, you may identify all sorts of specific currents or particular movements. So this is something that is a bit more specific. In this case, you could see that some of these currents, some of these movements, they originate, in a particular moment, and then they develop, and then sometimes, they enter into a sort of decline, they disappear, and then they are revived, they come back again, but they sort of keep some kind of identity. So it is still possible to identify some kind of narrative there, or some, a kind of history of that particular movement. So to give you an example, when we talk about occultism, this is something that, on which I have worked myself. When we talk about occultism, nowadays we tend to identify a particular current that begins more or less in the mid-19th century. Now, in the past, occultism was often used as a synonym for esotericism. So this created a lot of confusion, because you would have scholars who would talk about occultism in the Renaissance or even in antiquity, some others who would talk about esotericism, with the same meaning. So that's not a very good idea, I think. If you want to have a field of research, an area of research where people understand each other, it's better to use terms with one particular meaning and not be too ambiguous with the meaning of these terms, because if they overlap, then this creates confusion, especially for people who don't belong to this field of research. They come from the outside, and then they are sort of misled by this terminological confusion. So the same could be said by most of the terms you mentioned, like Rosicrucianism, Kabbalah, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, the fact that they all stick together and they can be included into a general discourse about Western esotericism is based on the perception of some kind of similarity. So the idea that, in fact, there is something common, there is some kind of thread that unites together all these different currents, all these different movements. And that's why it makes sense for us today as historians, or also as sociologists, or specialists also coming from different disciplinary backgrounds, to talk about all these currents, all these movements within a particular context, which is the context of Western esotericism. So that's, in a very, very simple way, I think, how we can explain the relationship between the general term and all these more specific terms that are subsumed into that more general term.
Okay. It's mentioned in the book how difficult it is to explain what all of this is to outsiders. And you just mentioned that for people who are not within the field, and even for lay people. And that it's made more difficult in that this information isn't included in school textbooks. It's not something that, it's just talked about everywhere. Do you think that this is changing, or that that will change eventually? Or is this always going to be a secret thing?
Well, I think that Hermes Explains as a book is certainly an attempt to make our field more accessible, more open. The field is esoteric, but the scholarly discourse about esotericism doesn't need to be. So, in fact,
correct,
the scholarly discourse about esotericism need to be as open and as translatable, so to speak, as any other scholarly field or scholarly discipline. So there has to be a constant conversation, constant communication with scholars from other areas of research, from other disciplines, from other fields. And also, it is important to communicate with lay persons. So persons who have, a broad intellectual curiosity about this kind of subjects. And even without being necessarily scholars, without, being specialists of anything really. So I think that the huge amount of work that we are doing with our research has to reach out also to these persons. That's really important, and that has to do, I think, also with the social value of research, which applies not just to the study of esotericism, but I would say to any field or any discipline in the humanities and more generally in scientific research. Now, there are two specific problems here that I would perhaps separate. So the first problem has to do with specialism. So the fact that sometimes, in order to talk about a particular subject, when you want to go deep into the issues, the problems that this subject poses, you need to have a particular language. You really need to develop, a kind of conceptual, let's say, weaponry. So you really have to develop terms, like a terminology and a conceptual arsenal that you are going to use in order to study your subject. This is something that, all fields, all disciplines do. So it's not something specific to the study of Western esotericism. So it is also important that we are clear about how we use these terms, these concepts. But at the same time, there has to be a kind of mutual effort. So those who want to understand what this discourse is about, the scholarly discourse about esotericism, well, they also have to do some homework. So they have to read relevant literature, reliable literature, and familiarize themselves at least a little bit with how these concepts are being used. Realizing very often that, in fact, on most terms, on most concepts, very often there is no universal consensus among scholars. Sometimes, scholars also use this terminology in different ways, which, of course, creates a complication. But this is also true for every field. It's not something specific to Western esotericism. So that's the first aspect, the problem that you have with specialism and the difficulty of translating what originates in the context of specialism into something that is accessible to a broader audience. Yeah. Okay, so that's the first aspect. The second aspect is, in fact, more specific to the study of Western esotericism, because it has to do with the fact that the study of Western esotericism deals with subjects that have been traditionally neglected by conventional histories So these are subjects that, for all sorts of reasons, very often have been brushed under the carpet, so to speak. And so this means that they have to be rescued by some sort of oblivion, some sort of neglect. Now, this is not always easy. This is not always easy because the point is that you have to justify yourself. For a long time, these subjects were sort of brushed aside. The general perception was that these things were actually either dangerous or not relevant, not important, and very often a combination of the two, actually. No, you have to justify yourself. You have to explain, wait a minute, no, these things are important because this and that. Dangerous, well, let's look into this and see, whether this is really true or not, and so on and so forth. And this is precisely, I think, the point that we wanted to make with Hermes Explains. That this formula that we used in the titles of the essays, this question mark that we put, was really pointing at that particular problem. So here, I think the field of Western esotericism has an added complication that you don't find necessarily with other disciplines or other fields. I mean, if you think about the study of literature, philosophy, these kind of things, you don't have to justify philosophy. No. I mean, philosophy has such a prestige, such a cultural prestige that goes back, millennia ago, not even centuries, that you don't have to explain to people why it is so important to study philosophy. Well, occasionally, sometimes you have to do that as well, depending who you are talking to. But let's say it's certainly a less hard task than to explain why it is important to study Western esotericism.
I found it interesting in the book that the red pill that is referred to, that's from the movie The Matrix, is mentioned in the introduction. Can you explain for the listeners how the red pill relates to Western esotericism?
Yeah, well, this was actually Wouter Hanegraaff's idea. He has always been a big fan of the Matrix. I mean, I am a fan of the Matrix too, but the idea
particularly so for
yeah. I mean, obviously, the film itself is a very powerful allegory, right? So many commentators looked at it as having a very powerful Gnostic message, right? That it relates to a kind of Gnostic ideal that you can actually wake up to reality. Normally, you are ignorant, you are in a sort of sleeping state, you don't see what reality really looks like, and then all of a sudden you have the possibility to wake up to that reality and see how things really are. Now, in Gnostic myths, this happens, rather differently, but in the film, it just takes a red pill. It's very fast, very quick, and very efficient, and very medical and scientific, and so on and so forth. So it cuts short with all the complicated procedures, that have to do with initiation and, particular spiritual practices that you always find in more traditional literature. Now, so the idea was, okay, well, we have invited 30 friends and colleagues, and this actually looked like so many 30 red pills. Because insofar as there is widespread ignorance about what Western esotericism is, what is it as a subject, as a field of research, so these 30 essays that are collected in the book can serve as so many ways to wake people up to the reality of Western esotericism. So beyond fancy, beyond myths, beyond legends, we offer, let's say, a more sober approach to the historical and social reality and cultural reality of Western esotericism. So that was the idea. And I have to say that, we found out at some point that maybe it was not such a fortunate idea after all, because we realized that in the meanwhile, and this, actually was something that was brought to my attention, to my huge shock when the book was already published. In fact, this metaphor of the red pills is being used today in right-wing circles, alt-right circles in the U.S., and especially circles that are developing around what is usually referred to as the manosphere. So that kind of huge network that has developed, especially on social media, all sorts of, online networks, that is extremely misogynistic, extremely conservative. And there the metaphor is used in a completely different way. So the fact is that, okay, in that sense, you would find the idea that men, have been so hypnotized by politically correctness, by feminist discourses that, they cannot understand what real virility, what manliness is anymore. And so we are here to wake them up. So we are going to tell them, what it means to be a real man and how a woman should behave and this kind of stuff. And I find this personally rather disgusting. I have to say it's actually as far as possible from my own personal views. And I mean, it's unfortunate. And I have to say, we were not the only ones. So, in fact, there have been quite a few other situations, quite a few other instances. For instance, in the music scene of groups, using the metaphor of the red pills, not having to do anything with this kind of milieus, with this alt-right, far-right kind of networks. And so they use the metaphor, and all of a sudden they realize, that now actually, especially in the US, I think less in Europe, I think people here in Europe are less aware of this connotation. Well, they realized that there was this connotation, and obviously, well, what do you do? I mean, if you have published a record of a book, it's a bit late. Well, you can release a statement where you say this. So I think we can use this as a statement, as one such statement where I totally disassociate myself, and I think we generally as HHP group from that kind of discourse about the red pill.
Well, it's good that you brought this up, because I was not aware of this association or this appropriation by this group until just now, than when you told me this. So so this is a good opportunity to make very clear what it means exactly, in this context that you mean by red pill, because it could be misconstrued as something else.
Well, and in the increasingly polarized political situation that you have today in the US, this is not immaterial. So this is something that is becoming extremely sensitive, of course, in the present situation with the spreading of conspiracy theories, QAnon, and all these kind of things. There is a kind of cluster of ideas that is being created, and unfortunately, something like the red pill metaphor is becoming part of this of this kind of discourse. So you want to stay clear of this kind of associations.
Yes, but it's also good to be aware of these different uses and different intentions and different, I guess, meanings that other people, other groups might use for the same concept as is the red pill in this case. So good to know. So we'll keep that in mind. So, at the risk of overusing the red pill example, I've selected several of the essays, the little red pills, as you called them. I've selected several of them for us to discuss today. And let's just jump right in. Let's start with Henrik Bodgan's essay, which is called, "Is it true that secret societies are trying to control the world?" And this essay discusses the polemical or contentious narratives that surrounds the topic of Western esotericism. So my first question regarding this essay is, what is it about these so-called secret societies that make people fearful or distrustful?
Well, first of all, I think it is important to point out that secret societies are not necessarily esoteric.
Correct.
There is historically an important connection between the two. So some secret societies are, in fact, practicing esotericism, developing a discourse that we can, call esoteric. But there are, in fact, quite a few secret societies historically that had very little to do with esotericism.
Good point.
Now, it is important to notice that those secret societies that had little to do with esotericism very often had a lot to do with politics. So why were they secret? Well, they were secret because they were doing things that perhaps political institutions, the establishment that be, would not consider acceptable. Would consider objectionable, dangerous, and so on. So they had, let's say, a political agenda, or sometimes even more broadly, a social agenda that would not be, let's say, attuned to what would be considered as legitimate at one particular moment. Okay, so I think that this makes it clear why they are perceived as dangerous. And usually, they are perceived as dangerous, especially by political institutions, because they are perceived as a threat. Now, there is a whole discourse based on conspiracy theory. So that's in fact, the core point of Henrik Bodgan's essay. So there is a whole tradition of conspiracy theories that tries to explain historical change, especially dramatic historical transformations like, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Revolution, and all sorts of other, dramatic events, world wars, and so on, as the effect of particular secret groups, secret elites, secret societies, and so on, which may or may not have to do with esotericism. So that's the point about dangerousness. And there is a whole literature that is being produced. This literature is a literature that has its own power of fascination. So, in fact, it has a public, it has an audience. In some periods, in some historical periods, this audience may become bigger. And this has to do with all sorts of circumstances, with particular tensions, for instance, with social unrest. In moments where things are being difficult, you want to have quick explanations, and usually giving the blame for what is wrong, what is wrong around us, right, to the dark power of secret evil groups, secret evil societies, is a very easy and quick answer. Okay, so that's a little bit about the social perception of the dangerousness of these groups. And as I said, there are different levels. Certainly, they are perceived as dangerous by the powers that be, and in that case, they are very often persecuted. So very actively so. In the period of the Restoration, after Napoleon's Wars, where there was an attempt of sort of bringing the clock back to the pre-revolutionary era, political regimes, especially in Europe, were extremely authoritarian, and therefore there was actually a flourishing of secret societies, because this was the only way in which people could organize themselves in order to express ideas, to spread ideas through these, kind of secret networks, secret channels, that it was not possible to express publicly, because there was censorship. And these groups were very actively persecuted. I mean, in Italy, you have the famous example of Carboneria. Carboneria was not a particularly esoteric group, so they didn't have, particular spiritual, religious, or esoteric beliefs. They were mostly a political group, so, and they had a political agenda. In this case, it was particularly related to the unification of Italy as a political process. And they were very, very actively persecuted by the powers that be, by the Austrian government in the north of Italy, by the Papal government in central Italy, and so on and so forth. So that's a typical example.
Right. Now, from the perspective of the secret groups or the secret societies, this concept of secrecy is quite important for this essay. Henrik Bodgan also talks about how secrecy is considered dangerous for outsiders. And can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, this has to do, I think, with the value that is being given to a particular truth, to a particular message. Let's call it an esoteric message. So this is a message that has to do with the ultimate secrets of the universe. So if you understand the message, then you actually have some kind of power. So this is the in the perception of the people who are part of this discourse, this is the exemplification of the dictum, knowledge is power, and power is knowledge. So if you understand these secrets, then you may have magical power, you can manipulate, in fact, reality, and you can ascend the ontological ladder of reality. So you can get to higher states of reality. But this has its own dangers, in fact, because, the ambition to perceive the veil that hides its truth requires hard work, requires many years of practice. I'm talking about, forms that this discourse may take. So that initiation is not something that happens easily. Precisely, it's not like taking a red pill.
Right.
It's the opposite of it. So the red pill would be the shortcut, of course. But in many, many esoteric discourses, in fact, the idea is that in order to comprehend, to have real access, full access to these ultimate truths about reality, many, many years of very, very hard labor are required. And if things go wrong, if you happen not to be able to, to comply with what is required, as a neophyte, as an aspirant to these truths, then something very bad may happen to you. So there is a danger. If the initiation process goes wrong, then you may be in real trouble. And there are plenty of myths, so to speak. Sometimes even in fictional literature, the most famous example perhaps is in Zanoni, the Rosicrucian novel published by Edward Bulwer-Lytton in the mid-19th century. So you have this story of a failed initiation. So in this sense, I think it is dangerous. But secrecy, is always has two sides. The fact that it's dangerous also makes it attractive. And this is something that has been studied by sociologists. The very fact of saying, I have a secret, and this is something very powerful, and in fact, it's also quite dangerous, there is nothing better than that, than to have fans, to have people who will want actually to have access to that secret. Yeah, give it to me.
Yeah, they want to know.
I want it. I want it now. Yes. I don't care if it's dangerous or anything. I want to be part of the game myself. So there is always a bit of ambiguity there. And I think it's the power of fascination itself. If you think about it, it's something that is very often there, not just with secrecy. That attraction always has something to do with repulsion or with something bad. You love and hate, something that is always there. But yeah, perhaps we are moving a bit away from the problem of secrecy now.
Right. Okay, so, but I think that's a very understandable explanation that you gave. So let's move on now to the groups themselves. The essay mentions several groups that have led to many conspiracy theories, such as the Illuminati, and I think everybody has heard of the Illuminati, but maybe not everyone knows who they really were. So could you explain who the Illuminati were from a historical perspective, and whether or not they exist today, as many people claim?
Yes, the Illuminati originally were a political group more than an esoteric group. That's the typical situation of a secret society which emerged in one of the periods in which Freemasonry was particularly fashionable. We are talking about the second half of the 18th century. In fact, the Illuminati was created in the mid-1770s. So in the 70s of the 18th century in Bavaria by a very interesting intellectual called Adam Weishaupt. So he created this group, and this guy had more of a political agenda, more of a radical revolutionary agenda, that was very much in line with some forms of radical enlightenment, actually. So not really interested so much in spirituality and this kind of stuff. Then later, in the history of the group, other members brought in fact, some esoteric and spiritual elements that were very much in the air. I mean, they were part of the Masonic landscape at the time, very much. So there were quite a few Masonic groups that did have esoteric elements, spiritual elements there. And so after the group was created, at some point, these elements were actually introduced into the group. But in fact, the group itself did not live for very long. Actually, the real history of the group spans not much more than 10 years, I would say, because, as I said, it was created in the mid-70s of the 18th century. In the mid-80s, so 1780s, it was discovered and brought to an end by the political authorities of Bavaria and of other European regions where the group had spread in the meanwhile. So obviously, when the authorities discovered that there was such a group that had this kind of radical political agenda, which actually sort of defended kind of revolutionary ideals, well, it was very logical that they would obviously persecute it and disband it and disestablish it. So that was the end of the Illuminati as an historical group. But then begins the legend, the myth, the fictional story of the Illuminati. And originally it has to do with a French priest, the Abbé Baruel, who started writing during the French Revolution, in the period of the French Revolution, started to write a series of books, Mémoire pour servir à l'histoire du jacobinisme. That was the original French title. So memories that are going to serve for the history of Jacobinism. So the real history of the French Revolution, not the ones that is evident, that is apparent, but the secret hidden history of the French Revolution, and who were in fact the real responsible for the French Revolution. Well, in fact, the Freemasons, and more particularly the Illuminati. So that this was actually a conspiracy that had been prepared in the dark by these groups, and that had brought the ancient regime to an end. So this kind of evil forces had been at play for quite some time before the French Revolution. They had conspired, they had created this gigantic plot, and then they were successful, in fact. So this was the real story of the French Revolution. And this was the beginning of a whole tradition of modern conspiracy theories, in which the Illuminati play a very, very important role. Actually, I would say, the role of the protagonists, so to speak. Very often, they are really, the main characters in these stories, even if actually they didn't exist anymore. And their real the real political action and influence that they were able to carry out during the 10 years of existence had been minimal, because they had been found out and they had been destroyed. So, in fact, this has created this tradition that actually is still alive today. So, especially in the US, the Illuminati are still very present in many conspiracy theories. It's something that is actually quite visible. And now the story has developed so much that the Illuminati, as they are present today in this kind of literature or conspiracy theories, have little to do nowadays with the historical reality. It's far removed, actually, from what the Illuminati really were originally.
So aside from groups like the Illuminati, who have had a real historical position, but have now kind of morphed into something else and represent something else now, another aspect that Henrik Bodgan brings up in his essay is that these secret societies have now taken on a anti-Semitic flavor, if you will, and you see that expressing itself in many, many different ways. Can you explain how anti-Semitism became a point of discussion in conspiracy theories from a historical viewpoint?
Yes. Well, first of all, anti-Semitism is not a modern phenomenon. So when we talk about this kind of tradition of conspiracy theories, especially related to the French Revolution as a starting point, and all this rejection or reaction to modernity, that's really a modern phenomenon. But anti-Semitism, of course, has a much older history than that.
Yes.
And the connections also between anti-Semitism and esotericism are also interesting in themselves. I think they certainly deserve to be explored. That's something interesting. Esotericism has, throughout its history, especially Christian esotericism, I would say in this case, has a kind of love and hate relationship also with Jewish culture. So you have quite a few esotericists who are certainly strongly attracted to Jewish mysticism, Jewish esotericism. Other esotericists who perhaps are a bit colder, or even may show some anti-Semitic aspects. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think it goes beyond the problem of conspiracy theories and the problem of secret societies per se. On the other hand, it is true that also the discourse about secret societies and the conspiracy theories that emerged, starting from the works of Barwell, at some point include also anti-Semitism very strongly. Barwell himself, by the way, was probably not an anti-Semite. He doesn't mention the Jews as having a particular role in the conspiracy. So his main target is really the Freemasons, the Illuminati and so on, but not so much the Jews. They don't really feature there. But after Barwell, you start seeing this emerging, and then it becomes really a very important element of this kind of literature, this literature of conspiracy theories. Now, I think that perhaps one of the reasons why this happened was that this literature of conspiracy theories was extremely widespread and important in Catholic milieux. So that's something that is very important. Barwell himself, of course, was even a priest. But you can see that throughout the 19th century and in the early 20th century, you see that this is actually something that has very often a Catholic flavor. It's not only, in Catholic milieux, but especially in Catholic milieux, this is something quite visible, quite important. In fact, especially the end of the 19th century, early 20th century in France, you have all these conspiracy theories that at some point get linked up also with the Dreyfus affair. This story about an officer of the French army who was of Jewish origin, who was suspected of being involved in a sort of conspiracy against France, of course, and then he was arrested and condemned, and then it was found out that he was completely innocent. But this really polarized the French society at the time, with people in favor of Dreyfus, against Dreyfus. So anti-Semitic milieus were particularly vocal, particularly visible at that period of time. And they were very often associated also with this literature that spread conspiracy theories, in which also occultism, esotericism played an important role. So there is a kind of juncture there that is particularly important. Now, I would say that if you try to look at it from the outside, so from a more longue durée perspective, I think obviously Jews have been, let's say, a minority, a religious cultural minority in Europe for centuries, actually, again, for millennia, even more than for centuries. So they have been present. And I think there again, very often you can see that there is a very deep fascination going on. The idea that in fact they live apart, they have their own culture, they have their own customs, their own traditions, and that maybe they also have something to hide. And that this thing that they are hiding is something perhaps powerful, is powerful enough. Maybe it has to do with magic. So I think that probably this is at the origin. This is at the root of the involvement of this anti-Semitic discourse with this conspiracy theories that very often targeted esoteric and occult groups.
Please join us for part 2 as we move on to other essays that deal with satanic themes in heavy metal music, why many people think that occultism is a breeding ground for fascism and Nazism, and what esotericism has to do with sex.